Tonight, we are going to be talking about the public charge rule and how it impacts people. So, my name is Allison Yeager. I'm the executive director of Florida Health Justice Project, and we are a member organization of the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition, which was a coalition which began in response to proposed changes to the public charge rule back in 2018, I believe. Um, so we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of the public charge rule, a little bit about the history of those changes and why this issue is so important. We're going to talk about who's impacted, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end. So let's get started, and we can go to the next slide. So, what is public charge? Um, so, when an immigrant applies for a green card, which is technically called permanent residency or permanent resident status, their application is going to be reviewed by immigration officials to assess whether or not to grant them the permanent resident status that they're applying for. And one part of that application process, one of the considerations taken into account by the government officials is something called the public charge test. And the idea with public charge is to see if that immigrant applicant is likely to depend on the government in the future for support. So, are they likely to rely on government assistance in the future? And it's really important to know, and we're going to get into the finer details of this in a few minutes, but it's really important to know right up front that the public charge test is not a part of all immigrant applications. And I will also say one other important thing to know is that most benefits that a person might be eligible for are not considered by the public charge test. So we can go to the next slide and get into some more details. So, who does the public charge rule apply to? Well, it applies to immigrants who are applying for a green card, like we said, which technically is lawful permanent resident status. And it also applies to immigrants who are applying from outside of the country to enter the United States. So applying for a visa to enter the US. So those are the only two categories of immigrant applicants who or applicants for an immigration visa to whom the rule applies. So really the bulk of those are going to be people applying for a green card. Which leaves a whole lot of folks who are applying for changes to their immigration status, for whom the public charge rule has no relevance. So it does not apply to people who are already US citizens, people who've naturalized already. It does not apply to people who already have a green card and are now applying for citizenship. It does not apply for people who already have a green card and are applying to renew their green card. It does not apply to refugees or asylees or people with VAWA visas. That's the Violence Against Women's Act. And it does not apply to people with T visas or U visas. Or people who have special immigrant juvenile status, that's the SIJ status, SIJ visas. It also does not apply to people who are applying for or renewing DACA, or people who are applying for or renewing TPS, temporary protected status. And it does not apply to Liberians who are eligible for DD. So the main takeaway from this slide is many immigrants are not subject to a public charge analysis. So that's really critical for us to understand from the beginning. And the reason that that point is so important is because there is a lot of concern about public charge in different immigrant communities. And we're going to get again into the history of why. But we know that there's a lot of information, a lot of misinformation and a lot of fear about public charge. So it's really important that we break down those fears with truth. And so one principal fact here is many immigrants, I would say most immigrant applicants, are not going to be subject to public charge. Okay, next slide, please. So it's also important to understand that when an immigration officer is doing a public charge analysis as part of an immigration application, that public charge test looks at a whole lot of different considerations and not just whether someone has accepted in the past the relevant benefits. So these are all of the different considerations when undertaking a public charge analysis. So it looks at age, it looks at education level of the individual applicant, it looks at the skill sets of the individual applicant, their income and or their assets. It looks at their current employment and their employment history. It looks at their health status, particularly with regard to their whether they're able to work. It looks at whether they have a contract with a sponsor, an employment sponsor. And then it does look at whether certain limited benefits have been used in the past. And so the key point here is use of benefits in the past is just one piece of this larger analysis. And critically, again, only two types of benefits that people may have received are considered. And we're going to get into those details in a minute. And it's also important to know that having an affidavit of support is considered heavily in support of an immigrant's application. So if someone has sworn that they will be supporting the applicant if need be, that weighs heavily in the applicant's favor. Next slide, please. So we've talked about who's impacted by the public charge analysis or the public charge test. Let's talk about what are the benefits that are considered in public charge. So what I mean by that is, we said this is a question of, is someone likely to become reliant on the government? And part of that analysis is that really multi-factored analysis, as we just looked at with all those squares. But one piece of that analysis is, have you received benefits in the past? But the government now is only looking at two types of benefits. All the other benefits are irrelevant. So they're looking at, have you received cash assistance to help support you and your family, and or have you been institutionalized for long-term care at the expense of the government? So again, critical point here, most people who are going to be subject to the public charge test are not actually even eligible for most of these benefits. So we know that eligibility for public assistance is very limited. So most people aren't even going to be eligible for the benefits that would be considered. And again, I underscore that to say so few people are really impacted by this. So thank you. So a little more detail about these two programs that are considered. So like we said, cash assistance on the left, long-term care institutionalization on the right. So by cash assistance, what we're talking about is temporary assistance for needy families, sometimes known as TANF. We're also talking about SSI, which is Supplemental Security Insurance, and that is specifically for people with disabilities. And then programs like general assistance. So public assistance for cash assistance for individuals as opposed to families. And then looking at long-term care, what we mean by that is spending time living in a nursing home or another long-term care institution that's been paid for by Medicaid or a state program. So another point to make here, if your family members, if you're subject to the public charge test and your family members are using one of these programs, this will not count against a green card application unless the program is the only income source for the family. Okay, so next slide, please. So again, thank you. Yeah, right there. Again, we're trying to underscore how few people are impacted and how few programs are taken into consideration. So most public programs that a person may receive assistance from do not count toward the public charge assessment. So the programs that don't count, that don't impact a public charge analysis, include healthcare, really critically healthcare. So you can receive Medicaid, your kids can receive Medicaid, your kids can be receiving CHIP, which in Florida is Florida Kid Care, Healthy Kids. You can receive care at community clinics. You can any of those programs or those types of care settings, including hospital emergency rooms, those do not impact a public charge analysis. Same with rental assistance. If you were to receive Section 8 housing assistance or public housing assistance, or if someone in your family was to receive those do not count toward a public charge analysis. Also, COVID supports, testing, vaccines, and other programs that Congress passed at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, like the child tax credit. None of those are going to impact the public charge analysis. Also, and the reason all of these, and I'm going to continue with the other three in a second, but the reason that these don't impact public charge is because our current federal executive, our current president, appreciates that all of these programs are essential to a healthy population, and that it's really critical that people be able to access these and not deterred from accessing these benefits. So other programs that don't count toward public charge: food support programs like SNAP, and which is also known as food stamps, and WIC, the Women and Children program, and school lunches. You can get those, your kids can get those, your family members can benefit from any of these programs, not have to worry about public charge. Same with cash benefits that are associated with employment. So things like unemployment or Social Security or pensions, your family members can have that sort of income and not have to worry about it impacting public charge. And lastly, other non-cash programs, and we don't include specifics here just because they can take many forms, but other non-cash programs that may come from the state. So again, bottom line, really critical point: benefits that are used by family members do not count in a public charge determination. So next, thank you. So some key advice related to immigration applications. If you're applying for a green card, permanent residency, and you do have concerns about public charge, it's really critical that you consult with an immigration and attorney, someone who knows this area of the law, someone who can give you solid and reliable advice. Don't get your advice from the news. Don't get your advice from friends. Don't get your advice from the person working at the cafe, talk to a professional who can really tell you what this area of law is all about. Now, one thing that's important to know is sometimes immigration attorneys are not experts in public benefits. So if you're worried that your immigration attorney does not know the full picture when it comes to public charge, there are some resources that you can refer them to. And then in a minute, we're going to also give you contact information for a local attorney in Miami-Dade who you can talk to. So this website that we have highlighted here, keepyourbenefits.org, is a great reference point for understanding what is and what isn't considered by the public charge rule. And there's also some great information on the federal USCIS public charge resource page. So those are some good resources to know. And we don't have the actual URL here for the public charge resource page of USCIS, but if you Google USCIS public charge, that will come up right at the top. Next slide, please. So why is this an issue that we've heard about? You know, a lot of folks know public charge or vaguely sounds familiar. Why is that? Well, this rule has existed for a long time, but in 2019, President Trump changed the rule. And the goal there was to make it harder for immigrant applicants to get green cards in an effort to bring down immigration to the US. So that change expanded the types of benefits that were taken into consideration. And there was a lot of talk about what was going to be considered and what wasn't going to be considered before the actual changes took effect. And even just as we started anticipating that change, rumors started flying, misinformation was everywhere. And that change really, the change and the anticipation of the change really scared folks. And it prevented them from getting the help and the resources that they needed. And we know that since that time, a lot of families, mixed immigration status families, disenrolled from benefits, disenrolled their US citizen children from benefits, even though, like I said earlier, having a family member receiving benefits does not impact public charge. But people were sort of abundantly cautious. And so people withdrew from SNAP programs and Medicaid and CHIP. And what that meant is a lot of people have given up essential benefits that they are eligible for and that will not impact the public charge analysis unnecessarily. They've given those up unnecessarily. And that's especially true given recent events, because in 2021, with President Biden at the helm, he ended the changes that had been made under the prior administration. And he changed public charge back to the way it had been previously. And just this past September, the Biden administration officially published their new rule. It goes into effect in December of 2022, and it basically contains all of the information that we just walked through. So everything that we just talked about is what's in the new rule. And then one of the other things that you may have seen public charge in the headlines, because there's been a lot of lawsuits related to public charge, because both pro-immigrant groups and anti-immigrant groups have been fighting in court about these rules. So again, key bottom line take-home point: the majority of immigrants are not impacted by the public charge rule. And that's really critical to understand and remember, and to tell your friends and tell your community members, tell your family, so that this unnecessary giving up of key benefits, so that we can stop that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we'll underscore 5 key takeaways. Most immigrants, like I said, are not impacted by public charge rules. Also, most public programs, most safety net programs like public health care, public food programs, public housing programs are not considered in the public charge test. Third, the use of public programs does not automatically make you a public charge. Like we said, it's a very complex and multi-factored analysis. Fourth, benefits that are used by family members do not count in a public charge assessment. And fifth, there are laws that protect the personal information of public benefits applicants and recipients, so that you don't have to worry that CIS is going to be raiding your information from state benefits agencies. Thank you. So that was a lot of information. If you want to review any of that, there are lots of fact sheets and know your rights documents and all kinds of great resources at this website, pifcoalition.org. That stands for Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition.org. And again, you can visit this website, keepyourbenefits.org, to help walk you through a personalized screening. And for those of you who are in Miami, one of our coalition, our Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition members is the Americans for Immigrant Justice, a fantastic organization we have here. And one of their attorneys, Cassandra Suprin, is available to answer questions. So this is her email address, csuprin, CSUPRIN, at aijustice.org. She's an attorney. She specializes in immigration, and she also speaks Haitian Creole.